Inga had never seen so much metal in one place before. The high lattice fence alone, which enclosed the narrow passage to the entrance of the filtration center complex, cost a fortune by the standards of the places she came from. The spirals of cutting tape that crowned the 4-meter-high walls seemed like the parts of giant's necklace to her. Patiently waiting for the queue to advance a couple of steps, Inga admired the glint of the midday sun on the endless curves and points of this dangerous jewelry. The squat, modular buildings of the filtration center were barely visible from behind the walls of the main protective perimeter, so Inga could only guess at their incomprehensible luxury. Back in home, in the settlement, all the buildings were constructed of cheap pressed bioplastic. Inga grinned. The settlement. She was still in the habit of calling it that, though now, after the third wave of refugees from the western floating islands, its population was already approaching 250,000. The heat from the sun, which had already almost climbed to its midday throne, was fierce. Inga waved a hand at the nearest guard, one of the few dozen standing along the queue. The face of the soldier was hidden behind the mirrored visor of his helmet, but he obviously noticed her gesture and nodded, allowing her to step out of the line and approach the water dispenser. This was another unfamiliar luxury for Inga. The fact that one could just open the faucet on a small fountain and get as much clean, fresh water as needed seemed almost miraculous to her. At home, even the water delivered by the greenies missions in oblong soft containers that looked like huge fat olive larvae had to be filtered several times. And water from the river was a liquid from which one had to stay as far away as possible. She touched her neighbor's hand, drawing attention to herself, and pointed to the water dispenser. As before, the neighbor, a tall slouching man with the chemical burn marks on his face, only nodded faintly. For several hours that Inga had spent in line next to him, he had not uttered a word. But that was pretty common for the exhausted people waiting to be processed in the filtration complex. They had gone through a lot to get here, and for many it was the last hope, the last chance for a glimmer of light in the darkness of hopeless despair, without any guarantees of success. Inga drank from the disposable cup, filling it to the brim 3 times, and returned to her place in line. On the way, she glanced at the guard, trying to see his face behind the mirror, but to no avail. It seemed to her that the guard turned his head slightly as if to see her off, and his hand on the grip of his assault rifle relaxed a little. But that could be just a play of tired imagination. Suddenly, an indistinct noise and shouting came from the entrance to the filtration center. Inga stretched her neck trying to see what was going on there, but nothing could be seen from behind the backs of the people in line. She still had a long wait before entering the center. The noise didn't die, and the wave of anxious excitement ran through the line. People were shuffling from foot to foot and talking softly. Men who had come with their families instinctively hugging their wives and children. The line went to a complete halt. Inga tried not to show her growing anxiety. Someone had told her that the guards kept an eye on potential migrants and could weed out those who, in their opinion, behaved inappropriately. True, for all the time she spent in the temporary tent camp near the filtration center and while waiting in line, Inga had never seen such a thing happen. But it was better to be safe. Considering the price of her lottery ticket, she simply had no right to take any chances. Nevertheless, she kept looking at the guard. So far, he stood still, only turning his head slightly to where the long millipede of a queue connected to the checkpoint at the gate of the filtration center. That meant nothing serious was happening so far. Inga was sure that in case of complications, the guards would react in much more active and obvious way. "Doublers," Inga's neighbor said. She flinched. Those were the first words and even the first sounds from him she'd heard in the few hours they'd been moving side by side. "Excuse me?" The man turned his head toward her. It was partially hidden by the hood of his sun jacket, so the upper part of his face, forehead, and eyes were barely visible against the bright sun in the shadows cast by the fabric. Until this moment, Inga hadn't really looked closely at her neighbor. Yet another one of the potential migrants. Judging by the burns, another former worker from the labor camps of the Greenies, either released for health reasons or a fugitive. In either case, migration was his only chance of living longer than a couple or 3 years. "Rumor has it that the Greenies have started trying to infiltrate through the filtration centers," the man said. Because of the scar tissue binding the burned areas, his face was almost devoid of facial expression. Inga remembered a faded old movie poster, crookedly pasted on the wall of a dive bar near her home. One of hundreds that Zun, the bartender and owner of the place, hung as design elements. Some character from ancient horror movie, similarly covered in many scars. They try to create copies of real people and provide them with lottery tickets and migration permits. They look human, but they're actually greenies. They want to infiltrate the outer colonies. "Greenies are humans too," Inga said, trying to keep her tone indifferent. "It's written in the Declaration of Separation." "Really?" the neighbor asked. There was plenty of emotion in his voice, as if to counterbalance the still face. Pain, bitterness, anger, hatred. Take your pick. "Then why won't the Confederacy let them off Earth? The outsiders don't want what happened to the Earthlings to happen to them. The Declaration is just a pile of legal gibberish. Its main purpose is to keep this dump locked up tight." "But we're Earthlings, and we're going to emigrate to the Outer Colonies," Inga said. "Once we're filtered and quarantined, the Confederation authorities will give us several worlds to choose from. We'll be able to decide where we want to live. I think, in time, there will be a solution for the Greenies as well." "A solution? Ha!" The burned man spat on the dry ground. "Hundreds of barely inhabited worlds. Somebody's got to work on them and fix them up. The outsiders need labor, but they don't need competition. That's why we, the scum of the earth, are allowed to emigrate, but the Greenies are not." Inga remained silent. She didn't feel like arguing with the radicalist. It wasn't that she disagreed with him so much. It was rather that she simply had no opinion on the matter. Having to fight desperately for survival for most of her life had discouraged her from thinking and worrying about politics. Her neighbor obviously belonged to the opposite category, those pushed to the other extreme by unbearable life, turning them into potential revolutionaries and activists. But then, what was he doing in this line? On the second thought, though, why not? Even radicalized people have to survive somehow. They need a roof over their heads and food, just like everybody else. And in a world almost completely controlled by the Greenies, for ordinary people of the Homo sapiens species, those two seemingly simple conditions of survival were quickly becoming luxuries. The noise at the entrance to the camp seemed to subside. Another wave of whispers and movement, and then, step by step, The endless human millipede resumed its monotonous, agonizingly slow motion. Thank goodness the neighbor made no further attempt to strike up a conversation with her. Every time they passed another armored guard, he squinted and mumbled something that sounded like cursing, but that was all. 2 hours passed. The queue stalled a few more times, but it was resolved quickly enough each time. During the last stop, Inga was close enough to the entrance to the camp to see what was happening at the checkpoint. The problem arose with the short, swarthy woman with the grim, worried face. She looked to be about 40 years old. Or if she was from the labor camps, about 30. People aged very quickly in there. To Inga, it seemed an almost unimaginable old age. There were barely 10% of the people over 30 in her home settlement. Like all the other applicants, the woman stopped at the checkpoint and stuck her hand into the primary scanning device. Nothing fancy, a primitive machine that checked the authenticity of a lottery chip. The whole procedure usually took a few seconds, after which the guards opened the turnstile and let the applicant pass to further thorough filtering, with mentoscopy and tedious filling in of a lot of detailed tests and questionnaires. This time, something went wrong at the very beginning. 10 seconds passed, 20, and the turnstile did not open. The woman froze in confusion, looking around until one of the guards came out from behind the counter and took her firmly by the elbow. "You'll have to come with us, ma'am," he said calmly. The woman still didn't seem to understand what was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, finally pulling her hand out of the intake port. "An extra check?" The guard looked indifferently into her face. "Please, ma'am, you need to come with us." Another guard came out and stood behind the woman. "Is there something wrong with the chip?" the woman asked. "I don't understand. It should be fine." "Please," the guard said. He looked like a primitive automaton, with only a few monotonous phrases recorded in its speech module. "You're holding up the line. We'll sort it out." The woman looked around helplessly. Despair and anger appeared on her face. "But everything should be all right," she shouted. "I was assured everything would be all right. It has to be. That chip cost me a fortune. Do you have any idea what I've been through to—" She suddenly stopped, but it was too late. Like everyone else, Inga had heard stories of people who'd gotten faulty and fake chips. The greenies and the agents of the outsiders fought the black market and fraudsters to some extent, but by and large, they didn't care much about the problem. The outsiders had enough of an influx of immigrants as it was, and the greenies didn't give a damn about the fate of the slum dwellers. So every now and then, some poor guy would get a chip forged at a lottery station in exchange for a winning DNA identifier number. After being caught, he would be sent to a labor camp or to the hell of a refugee settlement, and some of the lottery ticket seller's friends or relatives would fly to the Outer Colonies instead of the conned person. Unless they got caught with the stolen genuine chip, of course. But that was for those who had gotten the fake chip unwillingly, fully convinced that they finally had found a doorway out of the hopeless dead end of their lives. And this woman, admitting in front of multiple witnesses that she had willfully acquired the fake chip, expecting to use it to get away from Earth, was the worst possible scenario. No one knew exactly what happened to such felons, if only because no one ever saw them again. Inga involuntarily looked at the stoneware monument-like figure of the guard and shuddered. It was unlikely, of course, that this woman would now be taken to some secluded nook of the filtration camp and shot there. The outsiders were far too practical for that. But what then? There were rumors of gruesome mining worlds where the lifespan of immigrants was many times shorter than even on Earth, but there was no confirmation. The queue rocked and shifted again. People, as if nothing special had happened, passed through the primary inspection and disappeared into the camp behind an inner fence. Inga was sure that the incident with the woman had affected each of the applicants, but of course, no one would risk showing emotion. Not fear, not gloating, not even sympathy. No one knew what criteria the outsiders used to screen applicants, so it was best not to take any chances. What did this unfortunate woman have to do to pay for a fake lottery chip? Considering the possible risks to everyone involved in the deal, the price was probably the highest. Who did she have to sell for genetic deconstruction to the greenies? Her husband, sister, children. When only a few people left between Inga and the checkpoint, she began to get nervous. What if something went wrong? What would happen to her? She knew the likelihood of that was extremely slim. The lottery ticket provider from whom she had acquired her chip was one of the most respected and trustworthy in the village, the kind of man who would never risk his position for short-term gain. Usually, the chips from such providers were noticeably more expensive, but it was worth it. Even the greenies seemed to treat them a little better than the rest of the human herd hanging around their necks, thanks to their treaty with the outsiders. And still, a wave of anxiety was gradually spreading in Inga's chest, hot and chilling at the same time. Soon, everything would be decided. Tonight she will already be on the orbital platform. Or she didn't want to think about that or. 3 steps forward. A pause while another applicant is screened, then an indifferent "Proceed. Follow the green signs. Next." 3 more steps. And another 3. Finally, it was Inga's and her neighbor's turn. They approached, and after waiting for the green indicator on the scanner's front panel to light up, almost simultaneously slipped their hands with implanted chips into the receiving holes. There it was. A few more seconds, then the click of the turnstile. Everything happened so quickly that Inga didn't even have time to react. Instead of the clicking sound of the turnstile, her eardrums were struck by the grinding howl of the alarm siren. Behind Inga's back, the armored gates slid out of their slots with a rattle, almost hitting the next applicants. Controllers in light protective suits instantly disappeared into the back rooms, while a dozen soldiers in heavy assault armor, looking even more intimidating than the guards along the line, with automatic rifles at the ready, poured out of the nearby guardhouse door. On the massive block opposite the exit of the checkpoint building, 2 twin cannons came to life, aiming at Inga and her neighbor. Shocked and stunned, Inga stared in horror at the gleaming spirals along the gun barrels, ready to spit out balls of glowing plasma in her direction. That's it, she thought. But she didn't have time to think about anything else because she suddenly saw what was happening to her neighbor. The rough-cloth hood had fallen off his head, revealing scarred, hairless skin. Numerous bumps and ripples ran across his forehead, the top of his head, and even his face, as if some living thing was moving under his skin. His body twitched convulsively, sometimes assuming poses completely impossible from the point of view of human anatomy. Inga watched with horror as the features of the man's face began to melt like a piece of synthetic fat on a hot frying pan, something that only remotely resembled a human being. with large, multi-pupil eyes, narrow nasal slits, thin mouth without lips, and gill plates on a massive neck. Greenie, the Doubler. Inga knew that at least some of the greenies had the ability to morph, but she had never thought that they could copy a human's appearance to such detail. There were too many legends and myths floating around among the refugees to pay much attention to them all. And now these legends suddenly turned out true. She was always astounded by the fact that the progenitors of these creatures had been human before all the DNA manipulations. But now it made sense. Maybe it was some hidden, suppressed information in the genes that allowed the greenies to morph into the human form? And the scars on her recent neighbor's face were just a disguise in case the transformation went awry. But what was he counting on? And why tell Inga all of his tales if he was such a doubler himself? To divert her attention? But from what? It was so shocking that she froze in place, petrified. Who knows how it would have ended if one of the soldiers in assault armor hadn't jumped up to her and pulled her behind the counter just as his comrades opened fire. It seemed amazing that after what happened, she retained her ability to think and reason logically. And yet, she filled out all the tests and questionnaires without much difficulty. Whether her psyche was strong enough, trained by 23 years of life as a refugee, countless transfers, struggle for survival in camps, settlements, and floating cities, or simply the desire to escape from the hell of a planet that no longer belonged to humans was stronger than the shock, but she made it. She nodded in response to the professional and indifferent smiles of the camp staff as she walked from one test room to another, while the same picture kept popping up in her mind's eye. The soldier who had rescued her, lifting the visor of his helmet. His face was surprisingly young. He was hardly older than Inga. And saying to someone behind her back, "That's the third one today. Man, I do need a break." After which, he winked at her and said quietly, "Good luck." But luck had nothing to do with it. She deserved this opportunity. She paid for it by giving up to those damn greenies No, she shouldn't even think about that. She can't live with herself if she keeps torturing herself with memories. "The test results will be proceeded within an hour," another official said. "In the meantime, please proceed to room D7 for further examination." Inga swallowed, remembering the splatters and shreds on the soldier's armor and helmet. She still hadn't decided if she would have felt better if the blood had been red like humans. "Please lie down here on the couch," the mentoscopist said. "You can keep your clothes on." Not that Inga felt any regret parting from her home planet, which had brought her nothing but pain, despair, and fear. Still, she was a little sad that the shuttle carrying the next batch of immigrants to the orbital docks had no portholes or view screens. It wouldn't be a bad thing to cast one last glance at the blue-white ball with reddish spots of dry land. A glance of hatred and relief. Surprisingly, the young stormtrooper from the checkpoint found her in the evening after she went through all the procedures. Some of the applicants had dropped out after the tests and were sent back to the settlement. The rest were provided a hot meal in a large mess hall. After what Inga had been eating lately in the settlement, the standard fuel rations of the outsiders tasted like a gourmet dinner. and placed in a large hangar to wait for the shuttle to arrive. Without his armor, the soldier didn't look all that imposing, though he was certainly in far better physical shape than any of the applicants. "I'm glad it worked out for you," he said with a smile. "After such an adventure, I was worried about you. I hope you get to join us on Sanfion. We have a great planet. Clean, beautiful. I even wrote a note to the distribution committee, though I doubt they will listen to some sergeant's opinion." Inga only nodded. A lump in her throat prevented her from uttering a word. "I wish the General Council of the Outer Worlds would authorize full-scale immigration," the soldier said, looking around the room full of tired applicants. "It's not right to leave you here to live with these things. But what would I know about big politics?" He waved his hand and winked at Inga again, as he had done at the checkpoint. "Good luck again. The worst is over, believe me." The immigrants began loading onto the shuttle an hour later. The overload was pressing on her chest, making breathing hard, but not too much. Gravity compensators reduced it to a level even the weakest applicants could withstand. Inga smiled. She knew this would be far from the last test in her life. After all, the outsiders weren't recruiting them to enjoy life on the resorts, but it certainly couldn't be worse than living on an exhausted, jaded, alien Earth. And she must make the best of this chance. Otherwise, it would turn out that she had sent her sister that she did it for nothing. Inga cut this thought short and closed her eyes. Everything would be all right soon. Congratulations, well done. The infiltration was finally successful. They didn't notice anything? According to our agent's reports, the subject has passed all inspections and has already been transferred to the Ark. I must admit that your suggestion to lengthen the incubation period was so unexpected that I didn't immediately realize its potential. But it worked. I am sorry, of course, for the unit that died during the introduction, but it was a necessary and conscious sacrifice. For the first time, we managed to bypass the primary control because the infestation happened after it, and also to pass all the tests in the filtration camp because the incubation process was at its very beginning. You think they still don't know about our breeding methods? The outsiders fear and hate us. They had to reckon with us because we control the flow of labor they need. But that's all. They only know what we let them know. It was fortunate that Inga's sister, how ridiculous their names are, turned her in for deconstruction. Such a rare opportunity to work with identical twins. We can't take samples in the open. It would cause unrest in the settlements and displeasure of the outsiders. A rare case of the prudent behavior among humans. What did you do with her, by the way? You know, the other twin. She lives in special compound for selected humans. She's off limits to the outsiders now. We can't risk the whole operation. But she likes it there. We've created a privileged environment for her. Elite food, the best males. Humans are undemanding. That's good. Now we need to wait for the situation to develop. Hopefully, this will be a breakthrough in our efforts. Dismissed. The new planet smelled wonderful. They had been warned in the adaptation courses on the Ark that immigrants on new planets might experience xenoshock from the abundance of new smells, shapes, shades, and sounds. But all this, if it would happen later, in a week or two. For now, Inga was enjoying the vastness and wonderful aroma of the new, unexplored, and barely populated world. She was assigned not to Senfion, but to another outsider world, a planet with a single large continent and tens of thousands of islands scattered across the shallow world ocean. She was to work on the sea farms, growing edible algae and breeding modified fish from Earth. Every day to see the endless expanse, clean ocean water instead of stinking acid swamps, to feel the salty splashes on her lips, to breathe in fresh cool air instead of stifling fumes. Inga stepped from the skimmer ramp onto the rough concrete of the landing pad by the ocean shore and swayed from the feelings that came over her. She was overwhelmed with excitement, and for a moment it seemed as if something stirred in her chest, somewhere near her heart. But she just smiled broadly and walked with the rest of the newcomers to the farm workers, waiting for them near the accommodation facility.